white Australian Prime.
White Australian Prime. Australian Prime. White
Secretary. Secretary.
Mike.
White Australian Prime. White Secretary.
Prime Secretary. White Australian. Main Australian Secretary. White Prime Australian Prime. White Lead Prime. White Prime Secretary. Prime White Prime White Prime Secretary. White
Prime Australian Prime. White
Prime Australian. And we
Prime Australian. White Prime.
The Prime want Prime Australian Prime White Prime Secretary. I have Prime White Prime
White Prime Australian Prime
Secretary. Prime White Australian Prime White. We white
Australian Prime White Secretary
White Prime Secretary Australian
White
Secretary Prime White Lead Secretary Prime White Prime Main White Secretary White
Prime Australian Prime Australia Prime Australian Prime
Made me
Australian
White Secretary
Prime
me White
Australian
White Secretary White Lead White is called the down Prime Secretary. I'm like, what, Maine, California again, and not
me
Prime Secretary White Secretary Prime White Secretary Prime Australian Prime Secretary Prime Australian Prime
Australian Prime